On October 1962, the world almost ended. Not in a movie, not in a theory, in real life. For 13 days, the United States and the Soviet Union stared at each other across the edge of nuclear annihilation. And the terrifying part is this. Most people on Earth had no idea. Schools stayed open. People went to work. Kids played outside. While, behind closed doors, leaders debated options that could have killed hundreds of millions. And the crisis didn't start with an explosion. It started with photographs. Black and white images taken from the sky. Quiet, clinical, undeniable. Nuclear missiles in Cuba. Just 90 miles from Florida. Close enough to reach Washington, D.C. in minutes. Close enough to erase American cities before warning sirens even finished screaming. Inside the White House, President John F. Kennedy is handed the intelligence. And in that moment, the Cold War stops being cold. Because Kennedy realizes something immediately. If he does nothing, America looks weak. If he attacks, the Soviets might retaliate. And retaliation doesn't mean a battle. It means nuclear fire. For the next 13 days, every move becomes a question. Do we invade Cuba? Do we bomb the missile sites? Do we blockade the island? Do we negotiate? Do we threaten? Do we blink? And behind every option is the same shadow. What if this triggers World War III? Because once nukes launch, there is no undo. And the most chilling part of this entire story is that the closest moment to nuclear war wasn't caused by Kennedy or Khrushchev. It was caused by one man in a submarine, under the ocean, with no contact, and a decision that could have ended the world. Welcome back to a story where the most dangerous battlefield isn't a beach. It's a room filled with maps, silence, and men trying to calculate the end of the world. Today's episode is a 1-hour, immersive, cinematic breakdown of the most terrifying standoff in modern history. The Cuban Missile Crisis. 13 days. That's all it took to bring humanity to the edge of nuclear war. And what makes this story so powerful is that it isn't a story of superheroes. It's a story of pressure, of miscommunication, of pride, of fear, of leaders trapped inside impossible choices while time runs out. Because once those missiles in Cuba became operational, the United States would have minutes, maybe seconds, to react. And when your reaction time is measured in minutes, mistakes become irreversible. This video isn't just going to tell you what happened. It's going to show you why it happened, how close it came, and what nearly triggered nuclear war, not once, but multiple times. Including the moment a Soviet submarine commander believed war had already begun, and prepared to launch a nuclear torpedo. So stay with me to the end, because the Cuban Missile Crisis isn't just history. It's a warning, a reminder that civilization can be balanced on a thread, and that thread is often held by people who are tired, scared, and guessing. To understand the Cuban Missile Crisis, you have to understand the feeling of the world in the early 1960s. The Cold War wasn't a metaphor. It was a daily pressure. Two superpowers, America and the Soviet Union, armed with enough nuclear weapons to end civilization, watching each other like predators. Every speech was a signal. Every military exercise felt like a threat. Every new missile test shifted the balance. And the world lived inside that tension. But Cuba was different. Cuba wasn't just another country. Cuba was a flashpoint because of geography. It sat just 90 miles from Florida. Close enough that if Cuba ever became a Soviet military outpost, the United States would feel exposed in a way it never had before. Then came the revolution. In 1959, Fidel Castro and his guerrilla forces overthrow Cuba's dictator, Fulgencio Batista. At first, many Americans don't fully understand what that means. But as Castro moves toward communist alignment, America does. Because now the United States is staring at a communist revolution in its own backyard. Washington responds the way it often does in the Cold War, with covert pressure, sanctions, isolation, and plans to remove Castro. In 1961, the Kennedy administration approves a CIA-backed invasion by Cuban exiles. The plan is meant to spark an uprising. It's meant to topple Castro. It's meant to prove Kennedy is strong. So, it becomes one of the most humiliating failures in American history. The Bay of Pigs. The invasion collapses. The exiles are defeated. The world watches. Kennedy is embarrassed. Castro is empowered. And the Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, learns something important. Kennedy can be pressured. At the same time, Cuba becomes paranoid. Because Castro now believes another invasion is inevitable. And honestly, he isn't wrong. The United States continues planning covert operations, sabotage campaigns, and efforts to destabilize the Cuban government. So Castro turns fully toward the Soviet Union for protection. And Khrushchev sees opportunity. Because in 1962, Khrushchev faces a strategic humiliation of his own. American nuclear missiles are positioned in Turkey and Italy, close to Soviet territory. From Moscow's perspective, the United States already has nuclear weapons near the USSR. So Khrushchev thinks, why can't we do the same? If we place nuclear missiles in Cuba, we suddenly change the balance. We force America to feel what the Soviet Union feels every day. We protect Cuba. We gain leverage. And we maybe, just maybe, solve a Cold War problem with one bold move. It's risky, but Khrushchev likes bold. He believes secrecy and speed will protect him. He believes Kennedy will have to accept it once the missiles are in place. So the Soviets begin shipping missiles to Cuba, quietly. In crates. Under camouflage. Guarded by troops. And for weeks, the operation remains hidden. Until a plane flies over Cuba and sees what it wasn't supposed to see. In October 1962, the most powerful weapon in the world isn't a missile. It's a camera. Two spy plane flies high above Cuba, so high it's nearly untouchable. From that altitude, the island looks calm. Green fields, roads, small towns. But the camera sees something that doesn't belong there. Long, suspicious shapes. Construction sites arranged like military geometry. Launch pads. Support vehicles. The patterns are unmistakable. When the film is developed and analyzed, American intelligence officers feel their stomachs tighten. They're looking at Soviet missile sites. Not defensive weapons. Not conventional rockets. Nuclear-capable ballistic missiles. In Cuba. Just 90 miles from Florida. That distance is not symbolic. It's operational. Because from Cuba, Soviet missiles could reach Miami in minutes. Washington, D.C. soon after. New York. Chicago. The heart of America. And unlike long-range Soviet missiles from the USSR, these Cuban missiles shrink the warning time. The United States might have only minutes, maybe less, to react before impact. That changes everything. On October 16th, President John F. Kennedy is briefed. The intelligence is placed in front of him. Photographs. Interpretations. Trajectory estimates. And for a moment, Kennedy just stares. Because he understands what this means immediately. If the Soviet Union can place nuclear missiles in Cuba, the Cold War has crossed a line. This isn't just a threat. It's a direct, physical, nuclear gun pointed at the United States. Kennedy has to respond. But every response is a trap. If he does nothing, America appears weak. NATO allies begin to doubt American leadership. And Khrushchev learns he can push further. But if Kennedy attacks Cuba, the Soviet Union may respond. Not with speeches. With force. And if the Soviet Union responds militarily, that escalation could go nuclear. So Kennedy does something that might be the most important decision of the entire crisis. He creates a small secret group to debate options. A group that becomes legendary. EXCOMM, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. For days, they meet in private. No cameras. No press. No public debate. Just men in suits arguing over choices that could erase civilization. Some argue for immediate airstrikes. Bomb the missile sites before they become operational. Some argue for invasion. Remove Castro entirely. Some argue for diplomacy. But diplomacy takes time. And time is the enemy. Because the missiles are being assembled. And once they are ready, the situation becomes far more dangerous. Meanwhile, Kennedy keeps the discovery secret from the public. Because the moment the world knows, panic begins. Markets could crash. Allies could panic. And the Soviet Union could harden its position. So for days, the public lives in normal routine, while the White House lives inside a countdown. And as the meetings stretch on, one question dominates every room. What is the least catastrophic option? That still looks like strength? Because in the Cold War, perception is power, and weakness invites pressure. Eventually, Kennedy chooses a response that sounds peaceful, but is actually an act of controlled confrontation. A naval blockade. Except he can't call it that, because blockade is an act of war. So they call it something else. A quarantine. A ring of U.S. Navy ships that will stop Soviet vessels from reaching Cuba. It's meant to buy time. It's meant to force Khrushchev to choose. Turn back, or challenge American ships directly. And that brings the world to the next terrifying phase. Because the moment the quarantine begins, the first Soviet ship that refuses to stop could trigger World War III. On October 22, 1962, President Kennedy goes on national television. The broadcast interrupts normal life. Families pause in living rooms. Radios go quiet. Bars stop talking. Kennedy's face appears on screen, controlled, calm. But his eyes carry something heavier than politics. He tells the world what only a small group has known for days. The Soviet Union has placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, and the United States will not allow them to become operational. Then comes the announcement that turns the globe cold. A naval quarantine will be established around Cuba. Any Soviet ship carrying offensive weapons will be stopped. And if necessary, turned back. The words are measured, but everyone understands what they mean. The United States and the Soviet Union are now on a collision course. Because a quarantine is not just a policy. It's a physical line on the ocean. And when two superpowers draw a line, someone eventually reaches it. The public reaction is immediate. Fear spreads like electricity. People buy supplies. Some begin building fallout shelters. Schools practice drills. Newspapers print maps showing blast radiuses. The world begins imagining something it has never truly faced. Nuclear war. Inside the White House, EXCOMM listens to the aftermath of the speech. Phones ring. Allies call. Generals push for harder action. Because now, Kennedy's credibility is on the table. If the Soviet Union ignores the quarantine, what happens next? Does the U.S. Navy fire on Soviet ships? Does that trigger Soviet retaliation? Do the Soviets attack Berlin? Do NATO forces mobilize? Does nuclear escalation begin? And here's the terrifying part. No one can guarantee control once the first shot is fired. While the public watches the speech, the crisis moves into the ocean. U.S. Navy ships take positions. Destroyers, cruisers, aircraft carriers. A ring of steel around Cuba. In Moscow, Khrushchev reads Kennedy's message and feels the pressure tightening. He has his own credibility problem. If he backs down, he looks weak to his rivals. If he pushes forward, he risks war. And war in 1962 isn't tanks crossing borders. War is missiles rising from silos. So Soviet cargo ships continue sailing. Some are carrying weapons. Some are carrying missile components. Some may be carrying nothing. But the Americans don't know which is which. So every Soviet ship becomes a question. Is this the moment? Is this the ship that forces confrontation? At the same time, U.S. intelligence reports the missile sites in Cuba are progressing fast. Launchers being assembled. Fuel systems prepared. Warheads potentially arriving. And that creates another nightmare scenario. If the quarantine stops ships at sea, but missiles already in Cuba become operational, the crisis doesn't end. It becomes worse. Because now the United States is staring at nuclear weapons in Cuba, and the only way to remove them might be violence. So the quarantine is a clock. And the clock is ticking. In the open ocean, the quarantine line is invisible. No fence. No wall. No marker floating on the waves. Just coordinates. and the knowledge that crossing them could ignite nuclear war. U.S. Navy commanders receive their orders. Intercept Soviet ships. Identify cargo. Stop anything carrying offensive weapons. But here's the impossible part. They have to do it without triggering a shooting war. So the U.S. ships move with discipline, but every sailor understands the stakes. A destroyer closing on a Soviet freighter is not just a naval maneuver. It's a political act. The threat. A challenge. The test. And out there, Soviet captains are receiving orders too. Some are told to continue. Some are told to hold position. Some are told to turn back. But no one is completely sure what Khrushchev will do. Because the Soviet leader is trying to read Kennedy the same way Kennedy is trying to read him. The moment arrives. A Soviet ship approaches the line. American ships take positions. The U.S. Navy prepares to board. And the world holds its breath. Then, something unexpected happens. Soviet ships begin to slow. Some stop. Some turn around. They don't announce surrender. They don't broadcast fear. They simply alter course. For a moment, EXCOMM feels a wave of relief. Because it looks like Khrushchev is backing down. But that relief is short-lived. Because another report comes in. The Soviet ships turning back may not be carrying the missiles. They may just be carrying supplies. The missiles already in Cuba might still be advancing toward operational readiness. So the quarantine may be preventing more weapons. But it might not be removing the weapons already on the island. And that leads to the next dangerous escalation. Kennedy's team begins discussing airstrikes again. Because if the missiles become ready, the United States cannot tolerate them. But if America bombs the sites, the Soviets could respond against Berlin, or against Turkey, or against an American carrier group. And then escalation spirals. Meanwhile, the military pressure increases everywhere. U.S. forces go to higher alert levels. Strategic bombers are dispersed. Missile crews prepare. The atmosphere begins to feel like pre-war mobilization, except this time, the weapons are nuclear. And in Cuba, the missile sites keep moving forward. Construction continues. Camouflage nets are pulled. Concrete is poured. The launchers take shape. Soviet troops work quickly, knowing the U.S. may strike any day. Then another report hits EXCOMM like a cold shock. Soviet nuclear warheads may already be on the island. That means if the U.S. invades or bombs, American forces could face tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba. Not strategic weapons hitting U.S. cities, but battlefield nukes. Weapons that could vaporize landing forces, erase beaches, destroy ships. And the terrifying part is this. The Americans don't know the exact command and control setup. They don't know who has authority to use those weapons. They don't know if local commanders might launch under pressure. So now the crisis is no longer just between Kennedy and Khrushchev. It's between systems. Between armies. Between men who might misinterpret an order, or panic, or act on incomplete information. And as the days pass, communication between Washington and Moscow becomes strained, delayed, and uncertain. Messages take hours. Interpretations differ. And every delay creates the possibility of misunderstanding. This is when the crisis becomes most dangerous. Not because someone is aggressive, but because everyone is trying to avoid war, and still might cause it by accident. Inside the White House, the meetings begin to feel less like politics, and more like a countdown. Every day, new intelligence arrives. Fresh U-2 photographs. New estimates. New warnings. And the pattern is always the same. The missile sites in Cuba are getting closer to completion. Closer to operational status. Closer to the moment when Soviet nuclear missiles can launch from just 90 miles away. That changes the pressure inside EXCOMM. Because now the debate isn't just what to do. It's when to do it. Military leaders push hard. They argue that the United States is running out of time. They suggest airstrikes. Heavy, surgical strikes that destroy the missiles before they can be used. Then invasion. Remove Castro. Secure the island. End the threat permanently. To the generals, this feels clean, direct, decisive. But Kennedy hears the other side of the argument. the one that keeps him awake. Airstrikes might miss some missiles. Even one surviving missile could be launched. Even one surviving warhead could turn a political crisis into a nuclear event. And then there's another fear, colder than the others. If America attacks Cuba, the Soviets might respond in Berlin. Berlin is the exposed nerve in Europe. A divided city inside East Germany, surrounded by Soviet power. If Khrushchev wants leverage, Berlin is where he can strike. Shut down access routes. Move tanks. Force a confrontation. And a confrontation in Berlin could escalate just as easily as one in Cuba. So Kennedy's mind keeps circling the same nightmare. If we bomb Cuba, do we start World War III? And here's what makes it worse. There is no historical precedent for this. No playbook. No leader alive has faced a live nuclear standoff like this and survived. Every decision is improvisation. Meanwhile, something else is happening that the public still barely understands. The U.S. military is shifting into a posture designed for nuclear war. Strategic Air Command raises alert levels. Bombers are dispersed. Missile crews are placed on readiness. Submarines are repositioned. In other words, even while diplomacy continues, both sides are quietly preparing for the worst case. And this is the part of the crisis that feels like slow-motion horror. Everyone is preparing for catastrophe, while desperately hoping preparation itself doesn't cause it. Because preparation looks like aggression. Moving bombers can look like imminent attack. Deploying submarines can look like first strike positioning. Increasing alert levels can look like a signal that war is coming. So both sides begin reading each other's movements for meaning. And meaning is often imagined. Inside EXCOMM, Kennedy watches his advisors fracture into camps. One camp sees compromise as weakness. The other sees aggression as suicide. And Kennedy is stuck between them, trying to find a response that is strong enough to deter, but controlled enough to prevent escalation. Then another layer appears, the one that turns the crisis into a psychological trap. Khrushchev sends messages. Not clear, polished diplomatic notes, but emotional, shifting letters. Sometimes they sound conciliatory. Sometimes they sound defiant. Sometimes they feel like he's negotiating. Sometimes they feel like he's stalling. And the Americans have to interpret them in real time. Is Khrushchev offering a way out? Or buying time until the missiles are ready? Because if the missiles become operational, Khrushchev's negotiating position becomes far stronger. And Kennedy knows it. He knows that once the missiles are ready, they are no longer just a threat. They become a permanent hostage situation. So the U.S. pushes reconnaissance hard. More U-2 flights. More low-level flights. More photographs. But every flight carries risk. Because flying over Cuba means challenging Soviet air defenses. And if A-2 is shot down, Kennedy could be forced to respond. And responding could trigger a chain reaction. That's why the crisis is so dangerous. Because even when leaders are trying to avoid war, events in the field can force their hand. Meanwhile, in Cuba, Soviet forces are not passive. They are prepared. They are building rapidly. They are also under orders to defend themselves. And that creates the terrifying possibility that one local commander might make a decision that Washington and Moscow never approved. At the same time, Castro believes an invasion is coming. He's convinced the United States will strike. His posture becomes more militant. His rhetoric sharpens. And his paranoia, real or imagined, adds another volatile element to the crisis. Because now you have three actors in play: Kennedy, Khrushchev, and Castro. And Castro is the one who feels most cornered. A cornered leader often becomes unpredictable. The atmosphere inside EXCOMM becomes heavy. Men begin repeating the same questions, the same fears, the same scenarios. And yet, as the debates go on, Kennedy notices something subtle. A trap hidden inside his own choices. If he chooses invasion, he risks nuclear war. If he chooses airstrikes, he risks nuclear war. If he chooses to do nothing, he loses credibility and invites future aggression. Which means every door he opens seems to lead to the same darkness. So Kennedy searches for a door that doesn't look obvious. A way to offer Khrushchev an exit without humiliating him. Because humiliating a nuclear power isn't a victory. It's a setup for revenge. The problem is, Khrushchev has his own pride, his own rivals, his own political survival. And if he looks weak to the Soviet leadership, he could be replaced. And a replacement might not be cautious. So now Kennedy isn't just negotiating with a man. He's negotiating with a system, and the fear that the system might produce someone worse. This is the buildup. The pressure tightening in every direction. Missiles nearing readiness. Leaders trapped between strength and survival. And in the background, the US Navy still holds the quarantine line. Ships watching ships. Guns ready. Fingers near triggers. All waiting for the moment when one wrong move could make the world unrecognizable. As the days pass, the crisis begins to tighten like a noose. The quarantine is working, partially. Some Soviet ships have turned back. But the missile sites inside Cuba are still advancing. And Kennedy's team realizes a terrifying truth. Even if no more weapons arrive by sea, the weapons already on the island might still become fully operational. So the United States increases reconnaissance. More U-2 flights. More low-level flights. Jets flying so low over Cuba that pilots can see details on the ground. Camouflage nets, trucks, soldiers moving between trees. The message is clear. America is watching. But watching is also provoking. Because every flight is a challenge to Soviet air defenses. And Soviet commanders in Cuba are under pressure too. They are building nuclear sites on foreign soil under threat of invasion. They are armed. They are tense. And they are not always waiting for permission from Moscow to defend themselves. That's the danger when armies are deployed far from their political leaders. Local decisions can outrun diplomacy. At the same time, communications from Khrushchev begin to shift. His tone becomes inconsistent. One letter reads like an appeal for peace. He writes about humanity, about avoiding catastrophe, about not letting pride destroy the world. Then another message comes in, harder, more demanding. This one insists the US must remove missiles from Turkey. The Americans now face a nightmare of interpretation. Is Khrushchev offering a genuine compromise? Or is he splitting messages to confuse and gain leverage? Or worse, is Khrushchev losing control over his own military? Because if Khrushchev can't fully control what happens in Cuba, then negotiations become meaningless. Kennedy's team begins to fear that time is slipping away. And then comes the day that pushes the crisis from terrifying to almost unmanageable. October 27, 1962. It's later called Black Saturday. That morning, a U-2 spy plane is flying over Cuba again. Routine. Necessary. Risky. Then, without warning, the plane is hit. A Soviet surface-to-air missile explodes near it. The U-2 breaks apart. The pilot, Major Rudolf Anderson, is killed. News reaches Washington quickly. And inside EXCOMM, everything changes. Because now, the crisis has crossed into blood. An American military officer has been killed by Soviet forces. Kennedy is under enormous pressure to retaliate. The generals argue that this is proof diplomacy is failing. They insist the US must strike the missile sites and air defenses immediately. They propose bombing campaigns, invasion schedules, full mobilization. And Kennedy understands the terrifying logic. If he does nothing after U-2 is shot down, he looks weak. He looks indecisive. And he risks losing control of domestic and military support. But if he attacks Cuba, the Soviets may respond. And if they respond, nuclear war becomes plausible. For a few hours, the world is balanced on a decision. Strike or hold? Kennedy chooses to hold. He does not retaliate immediately, and that restraint might be one of the most important decisions of the entire crisis. Because historians later discover something chilling. The order to shoot down the U-2 may not have come from Khrushchev himself. It may have been made by Soviet commanders on the ground. And if that's true, then retaliation would have punished Khrushchev for a decision he didn't even authorize. And that could have trapped him. But restraint doesn't end the danger. It multiplies it. Because now Kennedy knows his control is fragile. The military wants action. The public wants strength. The Soviets are acting aggressively. And the missile sites are still there. And Black Saturday doesn't end with the U-2 being shot down. It gets worse. Because while the White House is reacting to the U-2 destruction, something else is happening under the ocean. A Soviet submarine, one of 4 sent toward Cuba, has been detected by American destroyers. The U.S. Navy begins dropping practice depth charges. Not intended to kill. Intended to signal. Surface. Identify yourself. But the Soviet submarine doesn't interpret it that way. Inside the submarine, the crew is exhausted. They are overheating. Oxygen is low. They have been submerged for days. They have little contact with Moscow. And they don't know what is happening on the surface. They don't know whether war has begun. They only know that explosions are rocking the water around them. And the commander begins to believe they are under attack. And on that submarine, there is a weapon most Americans do not even realize is there. A nuclear torpedo. A single weapon powerful enough to destroy multiple ships. And possibly trigger nuclear escalation. The commander considers using it. The tension inside the submarine becomes unbearable. The crew argues. Some believe they must fight. Some believe they must surface. And in that suffocating, dark, metal tube, one man becomes the difference between civilization and fire. Deep beneath the surface of the Atlantic, the world is smaller than anyone on land can imagine. No sky. No horizon. No sunlight. Just steel walls, dim red lights, and air that tastes like metal and sweat. This is Soviet submarine B-59. And in late October 1962, B-59 is trapped. American destroyers have detected the submarine and are dropping practice depth charges, small explosions meant as warning signals. To the U.S. Navy, these are controlled. Non-lethal. A way of saying, surface. Identify yourself. But to the men inside B-59, it feels like war. The submarine has been submerged for days. The heat inside is brutal. Systems are strained. The crew is exhausted, dehydrated, and running low on breathable air. Communication with Moscow is limited. They don't know what's happening above the ocean. They don't know about Kennedy's speech. They don't know about the quarantine. They don't know that the world is holding its breath. They only know this. Explosions are hitting the water around them. The hull shudders. Lights flicker. The air gets hotter. And the crew begins to believe the worst. They believe war may have already begun. And if war has begun, they are a Soviet warship under attack. Inside the submarine, the commander, Captain Valentin Savitsky, becomes convinced they are being hunted to destruction. He is angry, exhausted, humiliated by being trapped. And then he says something that, in hindsight, is almost unbearable to read. He tells his officers, "We're going to blast them now. We will die, but we will sink them all." Because on this submarine there is a weapon the Americans do not know they are confronting. A nuclear torpedo. Not a strategic missile. A tactical nuclear weapon meant for naval targets. Powerful enough to vaporize ships, kill thousands, and create a radioactive shockwave across the ocean surface. And in the logic of escalation, one nuclear detonation at sea could trigger retaliation. Retaliation could trigger counter-retaliation. And the chain ends with cities burning. Here is the most chilling part. Launching that nuclear torpedo on B-59 required authorization. But not from Moscow directly. It required agreement from 3 senior officers on board. The commander, the political officer, and the flotilla chief of staff. Because B-59 was not just any submarine. It was part of a larger mission. And that third man aboard B-59 was named Vasily Arkhipov. Now imagine the pressure in that room. The submarine is overheating. Depth charges are exploding. Men are sweating, shaking, gasping. The commander believes they are about to die. The political officer is furious too. He believes surrender is dishonor. And Arkhipov, the third vote, understands something terrifying. If they launch, they might not just die. They might kill the world. Savitsky wants to use the nuclear torpedo. He wants to strike back before the Americans destroy them. The political officer supports him. 2 votes are ready. And now all that stands between a nuclear explosion and restraint is Arkhipov. Arkhipov is not a loud man. He is not dramatic. But he has experience the others don't. Years earlier, he survived a nuclear accident aboard another submarine, the K-19. He understands how quickly disasters spiral. He understands that panic and misinterpretation can be fatal on a scale beyond imagination. He argues against launch. He argues that they don't know war has begun. He argues that the depth charges are signals, not attacks. He argues that firing a nuclear weapon without confirmation is madness. The commander argues back. The submarine shakes. The crew watches in silence, listening to voices rise. And here the story becomes almost surreal, because the world's fate is no longer being debated by presidents. It is being debated by exhausted officers in a metal tube under dark ocean with no outside information. This is the fragility of civilization. A nuclear war, if it begins, doesn't begin with a headline. It begins with someone misreading noise as intent. The argument reaches its peak. The commander is ready. The political officer is ready. The torpedo is ready. Then Arkhipov holds. He refuses. He insists they surface instead. He refuses to be the third vote. And because of that refusal, the nuclear torpedo is not launched. B-59 surfaces. The crew emerges into night air like they're escaping a furnace. American ships are there. But they don't fire. They don't attack. They watch. They signal. And slowly, the Soviet submarine withdraws. No one on those American ships knows how close they came to nuclear war. No one on land knows. No one in the White House knows. The world continues spinning, unaware that a single vote just saved it. Meanwhile, above the ocean, Black Saturday continues. Kennedy receives Khrushchev's messages. One message is emotional, almost pleading. Another is rigid and demanding. The Americans debate which message is real. Because it's possible Khrushchev is divided inside his own circle. It's possible the Soviet system is split between caution and pride. And Kennedy's team realizes something very dangerous. If they respond to the wrong message, they could harden the crisis instead of softening it. Then comes another terrifying event. The second U-2, this one over the Arctic, accidentally strays into Soviet airspace. Soviet fighters scramble to intercept. American fighters scramble to protect. For a brief moment, in the frozen sky, the crisis almost expands into another front. A misunderstanding, a navigation error, and suddenly nuclear-capable forces are racing toward contact. And every one of these moments is a reminder. The Cuban Missile Crisis is not a single cliff edge. It is a chain of cliff edges, a cascade of moments where the world could have fallen. By the end of Black Saturday, Kennedy understands that time is almost gone. If he waits too long, the missiles become operational. If he strikes, the Soviets could retaliate. If he loses control of his own military, or Khrushchev loses control of his, the crisis could ignite by accident. So Kennedy decides to do something risky, but calculated. He responds to Khrushchev's softer message publicly. The message that offers a deal. The Soviets remove missiles from Cuba, and the U.S. promises not to invade Cuba. Then secretly, Kennedy's brother, Robert Kennedy, meets with the Soviet ambassador. And in that private meeting, America offers something else quietly. The U.S. will remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey, but not publicly, not immediately, not in a way that makes Kennedy appear weak. This is the narrow door out, a compromise that lets Khrushchev claim he gained something, while letting Kennedy claim he stood firm. It's diplomacy under the shadow of annihilation. And by the night of October 27th, the world is still alive. But barely, because everything now depends on whether Khrushchev accepts the deal, or chooses pride. And as the sun rises on the next day, the world waits to see which one wins. By the morning of October 28th, the world feels like it's walking on glass. After Black Saturday, everyone understands they are no longer playing a strategic game. They are trying to stop a chain reaction. And the terrifying part is this. A chain reaction doesn't require evil. It requires momentum, misread signals, delayed messages, a commander who thinks war has begun, a plane that strays off course, a missile battery that fires without permission. That's why the turning point of the Cuban Missile Crisis isn't just diplomacy. It's the realization, on both sides, that control is slipping. Kennedy feels it. He feels it in the pressure from his generals. They want action. They want certainty. They want to eliminate the missiles permanently through force. To them, restraint looks like weakness. To Kennedy, restraint looks like survival. Because he understands something the military cannot fully calculate. Once you start shooting, you may not be able to stop. And Khrushchev feels his own version of that fear. He has placed missiles in Cuba as a gamble. A bold move designed to protect Castro and shift the balance. But now the gamble is threatening to destroy everything. Because the Soviet Union is not just confronting American ships. It's confronting the possibility of nuclear war. And inside the Soviet leadership, pressure is building too. Some want to stand firm. Some want to avoid humiliation. Some fear that backing down will make the USSR look weak in front of China, allies, and hardliners. So Khrushchev is trapped between pride and apocalypse. That's why the crisis becomes a psychological battle. Not a battle of tanks. A battle of narratives. Who blinked? Who won? Who looked strong? And here's the twist that most people miss. The deal that ends the crisis is not clean. It's not a clear victory for either side. It's a carefully constructed escape route, built to let both sides claim they didn't lose. Kennedy needs the missiles out of Cuba. Khrushchev needs a way to pull back without being humiliated. So the solution becomes two-layered. Publicly, Kennedy offers a pledge. The United States will not invade Cuba. That's what Khrushchev can show the Soviet public. That's what Castro can interpret as survival. But privately, something else happens. The U.S. secretly agrees to remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey. Those missiles are already being phased out. They're outdated. But politically they matter. Because Khrushchev can tell his inner circle, we forced America to remove missiles near our border. We extracted a concession. We didn't simply retreat. This is the twist of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The world is saved by a secret deal. A deal that the public won't fully understand for years. And that secrecy matters, because it reveals something uncomfortable. Even the most powerful leaders sometimes need hidden compromises to avoid catastrophe. Now imagine the emotional pressure inside the Soviet embassy as Robert Kennedy meets the Soviet ambassador, Anatoly Dobrynin. The conversation isn't theatrical. It's tense, controlled, almost cold. Because both men understand what's underneath the words. Nuclear war. They speak in careful phrases. They imply threats without shouting them. They offer exits without calling them exits. And when Dobrynin reports back to Moscow, Khrushchev has to decide quickly. Because time is still moving. Missiles in Cuba are still being assembled. U.S. military forces are still on alert. And one more incident, one more mistake, could rip the crisis open again. So Khrushchev chooses. He accepts. On October 28, he sends a message announcing that the Soviet Union will dismantle the missile sites and remove the weapons from Cuba. The world exhales. The immediate danger begins to recede. But here's what makes this moment haunting. The crisis ends not because the world became safe. It ends because both sides finally recognized something terrifying. They were closer to nuclear war than either one had intended. And the turning point isn't the acceptance itself. It's what Khrushchev privately admits to his own circle afterward. This went too far. We almost lost control. The Cuban Missile Crisis becomes the moment both superpowers realize the Cold War cannot continue at this intensity without eventually turning hot. So after the crisis, quiet changes begin. Hotlines. New communication channels. Treaties. Arms control discussions. Not because either side becomes peaceful. But because both sides have now seen the edge. They have stared into it. And once you've done that, you can't pretend it isn't there. When Khrushchev's message arrives, the world breathes out. But not everyone feels relief. Because the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis isn't a clean ending. It's a complicated survival. First, Cuba. Fidel Castro is furious. From his perspective, Cuba was the battlefield. Cuba was the target. Cuba was the nation that would be invaded, bombed, or turned into ash. And yet the final deal is made without him. Castro learns that the Soviets are removing the missiles, and he feels betrayed. He believed the missiles were a shield, a guarantee that the US could never invade again. Now that shield is being packed up and shipped away. And Castro's anger isn't just personal. It reveals a deeper truth. Small nations caught between superpowers rarely control their own fate. They become bargaining chips. Castro remains in power, but he never forgets the lesson. He realizes that even alliances can become sacrifices. Now, Moscow. Khrushchev doesn't emerge as a hero inside the Soviet system. To the outside world, he may have avoided nuclear war. But inside the Kremlin, he has taken a massive political hit. Hardliners accuse him of reckless gambling. They argue that he humiliated the Soviet Union by withdrawing missiles under American pressure. Even though Khrushchev can claim he gained a pledge against invasion, even though he can claim the secret Turkey missile removal, the perception inside Soviet politics is harsh. He took a risk. He blinked first publicly. And in authoritarian systems, perception can be fatal. Within 2 years, Khrushchev will be removed from power. The Cuban Missile Crisis becomes one of the factors that weakens him. Now, Washington. Kennedy is often remembered as the calm hero of the crisis. And in many ways he was. He resisted military pressure. He sought a controlled response. He accepted compromise. But Kennedy doesn't feel triumphant afterward. He feels shaken. Because Kennedy realizes something chilling. The United States didn't win. The United States survived. And survival isn't guaranteed next time. Kennedy's closest circle begins to understand that the Cold War has a terrifying flaw. It can escalate without intention. Even if both leaders want peace, events can push them toward war. That means nuclear war isn't just a decision. It's a risk baked into the system. That's why Kennedy begins supporting new measures afterward. More direct communication with Moscow. A hotline. Arms control steps that reduce the chance of accidental escalation. Not because he trusts the Soviet Union, but because he understands the danger of misinterpretation. This is why the crisis is often called a turning point. Not because the Cold War ended, but because both sides began to recognize the need for guardrails. The crisis also changes public psychology. For years, people had lived with abstract fear of nuclear war. But after October 1962, that fear becomes real. Parents look at their children differently. Governments think differently. The idea that civilization can be erased in hours becomes part of modern consciousness. And here's another twist most people miss. The Cuban Missile Crisis isn't just about what Kennedy did, or what Khrushchev did. It's about what individuals below them did. The missile battery that shot down the U-2. The submarine commander preparing a nuclear torpedo. The U.S. destroyers dropping charges. These were local decisions. Human decisions made under stress. That means the world was saved partly by leaders, and partly by luck, and partly by restraint from individuals who never became famous. This is the unsettling conclusion. The crisis ends, but the mechanisms that almost triggered nuclear war remain. Missiles still exist. Armies still prepare. Alerts still rise. Errors still happen. So October 1962 becomes less of a victory story and more of a warning. A warning that civilization can be balanced on miscommunication. And if you want the cold truth, the lesson of the Cuban Missile Crisis isn't, we handled it well. The lesson is, we almost didn't, even after Khrushchev agrees. The crisis doesn't end instantly. Because nuclear danger doesn't vanish like a switch. It fades slowly, like a storm moving away, while lightning still flashes on the horizon. In the days that follow, the United States demands verification. Not promises. Proof. The missiles have to be dismantled, loaded, placed onto ships, removed from Cuban soil. And throughout this process, American military forces remain on high alert. Bombers are still ready. Missiles are still fueled. Submarines are still positioned. The world is still living inside a tense silence, waiting to see if the Soviets truly follow through. This is where the emotional climax of the Cuban Missile Crisis deepens. Because even though leaders have chosen a path away from nuclear war, the machinery of war is still running. And machines don't care about diplomacy. They do what they're built to do. Behind the scenes, declassified details later reveal something horrifying. The United States didn't know the full truth during the crisis. American officials assumed Soviet nuclear warheads were still offshore. They assumed the missiles weren't fully ready. They assumed the Soviets would need time to prepare nuclear weapons for use. But after the Cold War, evidence shows some warheads were already in Cuba, and Soviet commanders had authority frameworks that could have enabled nuclear use under invasion scenarios. Meaning if the US had invaded Cuba, American forces could have been met with nuclear weapons. Not against US cities. Against US troops and ships. A battlefield nuclear detonation that could have forced the United States to respond. And once the nuclear threshold is crossed, even tactically, the chance of escalation becomes terrifyingly high. So the emotional peak of this story isn't just fear. It's the realization that the world wasn't dancing on the edge. It was standing on it. And most citizens never knew. Imagine families in October 1962. Some people truly felt the danger. They watched Kennedy's speech. They saw headlines. They felt the tension. Many began buying canned food, water, batteries. Some built shelters in backyards. Children practiced duck and cover drills at school. But most people still didn't grasp how close it was. Because the mind can't easily picture extinction. It's too large, too unimaginable. So life continued. And that's what makes the Cuban Missile Crisis eerie. The world looked normal, while the highest level of military readiness since World War II was quietly unfolding. Inside military command centers, officers monitored radar screens and alert levels. Pilots slept beside aircraft. Submarine crews waited for coded orders. Men sat at consoles where one signal could mean launch. And the terrifying truth is this. If the wrong order had been sent, or misread, nuclear weapons could have launched even if the political leadership didn't want them to. This is the real climax. Not the letters. Not the speeches. But the vulnerability of the system. The fact that civilization's survival depended on restraint. And on things going right. In a system designed for violence. And then, slowly, the verification happens. American planes photograph dismantled missiles. Soviet ships carry missile components away. The world begins to step back from the cliff. But even in relief, something dark remains. Because everyone in the inner circle has been changed. Kennedy is changed. His advisors are changed. Khrushchev is changed. Their military leaders are changed. They now understand what nuclear weapons mean in practice. Not as a deterrent in theory, but as a fragile reality controlled by human beings. And if you listen closely to how Kennedy speaks afterward, you can hear the difference. It's subtle, but it's there. A recognition that strength isn't just aggression. It's restraint under pressure. And for the rest of the world, the crisis leaves behind a shadow that never fully disappears. Because once humanity realizes it can end itself, that knowledge doesn't go away. It becomes a permanent part of modern life. The Cuban Missile Crisis ends, but the awareness it created remains. When the missiles leave Cuba, the world doesn't celebrate like it does after a war. Because this wasn't a victory. It was a narrow escape. And narrow escapes change behavior. The Cuban Missile Crisis produces a strange outcome. Both superpowers emerge more afraid of themselves. Because for the first time, the United States and the Soviet Union fully understand what nuclear weapons mean in motion. Not on paper. Not in speeches. But in the real world, where misunderstanding, pride, and exhaustion can trigger irreversible action. That fear becomes the foundation for the first major guardrails of the nuclear age. One of the most direct results is the Washington-Moscow hotline, a direct communication line between the White House and the Kremlin. Not because Kennedy and Khrushchev suddenly trust each other, but because they fear delays. In the crisis, messages took hours, sometimes longer. Letters crossed in confusing sequences. Interpretations changed. And in nuclear standoffs, time delays can kill the world. So the hotline is born. A simple idea that becomes one of the most important tools in preventing accidental war. When leaders need to speak, they speak directly. Another major consequence is arms control. Within a year, the United States and the Soviet Union signed the Partial Test Ban Treaty, 1963, restricting nuclear testing in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater. Again, this isn't because either side becomes peaceful. It's because both sides have seen what the arms race is building toward. And once you've stared at that cliff, you start thinking about fences. The crisis also changes military doctrine. Before 1962, the logic of nuclear strategy often leaned heavily on massive retaliation. The idea that any major conflict could be answered with overwhelming nuclear force. After the crisis, that idea begins to feel dangerously rigid, because rigid strategies don't leave room for de-escalation. So nuclear planning begins to evolve. More flexible response options. More attention to escalation control. More emphasis on signaling and communication. Because in the Cuban Missile Crisis, the most important weapon wasn't the bomb. It was the message. What you signaled. What you implied. What your opponent believed. The crisis also leaves a deep mark on leadership psychology. Kennedy begins viewing the Cold War not as a contest of pure strength, but as a long, dangerous balancing act. His public rhetoric remains firm, but privately he's more cautious, more aware that the real enemy might be momentum itself. Khrushchev, for his part, becomes more determined to avoid direct nuclear confrontation in the future. But politically, he pays a price. The Cuban Missile Crisis damages his standing in the Soviet leadership, contributing to his eventual removal. So the crisis reshapes Soviet politics too. It becomes a lesson that bold moves can backfire catastrophically. For Cuba, the consequences are also heavy. Castro survives. The U.S. pledge not to invade helps secure his rule. But Cuba becomes more isolated, more militarized, and permanently shaped by its role as a Cold War battlefield. And there's a final, haunting consequence that might be the most important of all. The Cuban Missile Crisis becomes a permanent reference point. Every future crisis is measured against it. Every close call is compared to October 1962. Because it's the moment humanity learned, beyond theory, that it can erase itself. And once you learn that, history changes. The Cold War continues. Wars still happen. The arms race continues. But after the missile crisis, both sides begin to treat the nuclear threshold with a kind of sacred fear. Not always successfully. Not always consistently. But enough to create a new unspoken rule. You can threaten. You can posture. You can fight indirectly. But you do everything possible to avoid pushing the button. Because in October 1962, they saw what pushing the button could mean. If you want to understand the modern world, you have to understand October 1962. Because the Cuban Missile Crisis isn't just a Cold War story. It's a permanent warning about how fragile control really is. The first modern lesson is simple and frightening. Nuclear war doesn't require evil. It requires error. A misread signal. A delayed message. A local commander acting without permission. A system interpreting noise as attack. That's why the Cuban Missile Crisis still matters today, maybe more than ever. Because modern warfare is faster. Messages move instantly. Decisions happen in seconds. And in that speed, the margin for misunderstanding can shrink to nothing. The second lesson is about escalation. During the crisis, Kennedy and Khrushchev both tried to signal strength without crossing the line. They used blockades, speeches, military alerts, diplomatic letters. But signaling is risky. Because signals don't always land the way you intend. Your opponent might misinterpret. Your own military might react too aggressively. Your allies might push you into harder positions. In the modern age, this is even more dangerous. Because now you have cyber operations. electronic warfare, disinformation campaigns, false warnings, spoofed signals. A cyber attack could appear like the first strike of a broader assault. A hacked radar system could report incoming missiles that aren't real. And in nuclear scenarios, leaders might have minutes to decide. So the missile crisis teaches something urgent. False information can be as dangerous as real weapons. Another modern lesson is about decision windows. Arkapov's moment on the submarine wasn't just dramatic. It was structural. The world came close to nuclear war because there was a decision window where exhausted humans had to decide what was happening. No full intelligence. No real-time confirmation. Just pressure. That dynamic still exists today. Every nuclear system still includes human decision points, sometimes under extreme stress. And that means the safety of civilization still depends on restraint and clarity. Finally, the Cuban Missile Crisis teaches that winning is not always the goal. Sometimes survival is the goal. Kennedy accepted a compromise. Khrushchev accepted a compromise. They found a way out that allowed both sides to claim dignity. That's an unpopular truth in modern politics, where compromise is often framed as weakness. But in nuclear realities, compromise can be strength. Because strength isn't just the ability to fight. It's the ability to stop fighting before the world ends. So the Cuban Missile Crisis becomes the story of a world that survived not because it was brave, but because it was cautious at the right moments. And because one man, Arkhipov, refused to turn uncertainty into nuclear fire. That's why the crisis doesn't feel like the past. It feels like a shadow over the future. Because the weapons still exist. The decision windows still exist. And human beings are still human. And that was the Cuban Missile Crisis. 13 days where the world didn't just feel dangerous. To us. Not because everyone wanted war. But because war can happen even when everyone is trying to avoid it. A photograph. A speech. A plane shot down. A submarine trapped in the dark. A single vote. And the difference between history continuing and history ending. If you enjoyed this kind of immersive, suspenseful history storytelling, where the tension is real because the stakes were real, make sure you subscribe. Because we're going deeper into the moments where civilization almost snapped. Next, we're telling a story that feels like fiction, but happened in reality. A false alarm inside the Soviet Union, where one officer saw nuclear missiles on a radar screen and had minutes to decide whether to report it as an American attack. One wrong call, and the world would have burned. So if you want that episode, subscribe now. And if you made it all the way through these 13 days, comment the word 13 days. I read the comments. And it tells me you want more one-hour stories where history doesn't feel distant. It feels like you're standing in the room when the world decides its future.